Good morning, or wherever you might be, evening, day, whatever might part of the world you live in. It's Dr. Gene Mesko with Mostly Hairless Apes, talking to you from the Church of Science here, and just wondering how things are going out there. I talked last time about the health of the system, and I wanted to dive deeper because I've been trying to sort out this model of artificial selection, of how humans create the world. And obviously, we're building out of biology. And the core social unit out of biology for artificial selection is the family. And that's the core, but I needed to extend that. If we wanted to build a world, if we wanted to improve things, how could we go about doing that? Well, I think we should build on what already works. I mean, that's what evolution teaches us. Evolution teaches us that whatever works persists. Whatever amalgamation of information allows you to maintain balance, homeostasis, as we call it in biology, keeps an organism alive. But how do you extend that to the species? How can you have evolutionary homeostasis? We talk about stasis in evolution as the persistence of a constant form, a constant type of species. And obviously we get evolutionary change. But when you think about evolution over time, it's a relatively slow process. I mean, the biological definition for natural selection tells us that it's changes in allele frequencies in populations over generations. And that boils down to genetic changes, either through recombination events during meiosis or mutations, modifications based on epigenetics. There's a variety of ways to change the DNA information. But I've been talking about artificial selection. How do humans, as conscious individuals, change things? When we make decisions, we will not go down the rabbit hole of the philosophers arguing free will, whether it exists or not. We're going to assume that within consciousness, there's as an adaptation of an evolving brain, that there's some ability when you find peace and quiet, when you can resist hormonal urges and natural selection impulses that bubble up through our bodies, that somewhere in our brains we're able to examine the accumulated information we acquire during our lifetime, and we're able to make choices. And that's what alters our reality around us as we implement those artificially generated, those brain-generated ideas, that information, that mental information. And that mental information lets us change how we organize our social systems. Now, one of the big things for artificial selection needs to distinguish civilizations from societies here. Because that's one of the challenges. Biology has the ability to subdivide into fields like any other scientific discipline. We can talk about evolution and genetics. We can also talk about animal behavior. And lots of animals have societies. Specifically, it's called ethology, if you want to get a little nerdy. But the idea of social organizations are prevalent in a variety of species. It's obviously a common adaptation to build up social mechanisms. That affinity, there's a component of what we call kin selection in evolution, that families select for each other because that enhances our DNA as the model there. We won't get into Hamilton's rule or anything fun like that today. Excuse me. But we will have the idea that family is important. And if we want to talk about civilization, my model for civilization, based on artificial selection, is that consciousness can generate ideas. And at the core of every civilization, and this is what distinguishes it from a society of animals, is that conscious beings have the ability to generate belief, to generate ideas that we can't verify, but we decide something's important. And this is what I talked in the past about religion bugging me. But why are religions so prevalent? If I'm going to follow my own advice and think about evolution as what persists is what works, evolution would make the case that religions are an amazingly useful adaptation Religions give us the ability to form ideas about how stuff's work. And we've come up with lots of deities as ideas. Now, just for the sake of clarity here, we'll once again profess my atheism in that I don't think any religion has got it right. There very well might be magical, superpowered beings out there. There are obviously forces in the universe that we don't understand, as we don't have a complete model. Physicists have drilled down to subatomic particles of matter and energy and waves that underlie a lot of forces, and we're able to build this marvelous technological world because they have a pretty good description of how all that stuff works. And we have global communication networks and satellites and space exploration and all sorts of fascinating things built on the idea of electrons moving with certain patterns. And darned if they don't behave that way consistently. And obviously we get some glitches in the system, but that's the complexity involved in building up more higher level systems. But let's get back to civilization. And the idea of civilization, then, is a society of animals with consciousness who organize around mental information, an idea, a belief. And we build off of that from biology because of the core social unit of the family. And here's the big transition then. Here's where we're going to start making the plan of how do we build a better social system, how we build a better civilization, that we could actually make a global civilization. Because what's the essence of any human civilization? The essence of any human civilization is that we have rules. That's the essence of government. That's the big adaptation that we use, is that instead of just relying on biological force, which is what the orange parasite wants us to do, or use, which is really nothing different than capitalistic force. And the economy is just a way to distribute the resources that we need to stay alive. That's what social systems do. We decide how to share all that stuff that's out there. And in the process of sharing, some people are happy with that, others aren't. But if you think about really basic societies, basic civilizations, a lot of them ultimately end in force. And there's lots of philosophers who will tell you that the only role of government is to enforce order and maintain order within the system, which, if you think about it from a biological perspective, is no more than maintaining order through threats. That's really what happens there. And this is where religion has tried to make a difference. Religion has appealed to a different idea. Other than, well, some of them still rely on it for fear, because if it's retribution, if it's physical retribution, that is the mechanism of enforcing the rules for a given civilization, that's really not any different than most biological societies, most animal societies. The alpha male or the alpha in a given pack enforces order by battling. They have to compete. You run off the other males or the alpha females in some cases. You have these alphas that run the system because it's basically, I can beat you up and you better listen to me. But here's where civilizations differ. They try to make a rule. And we've tried it for years. And most of them have been enforced by gods. And that's been a useful adaptation. We've used it for thousands of years. The divine right of kings has tied it together in a lot of civilizations, where you could link in the belief system along with the government system and say, oh, they're really one and the same. And with that, we're going to have an economy. And that's where capitalism comes in as the major adaptation. We've talked about capitalism as our major economic adaptation, because before that, when you had the government controlling the money, then you could tie together church and state and the economy all into one nice big bundle. And that all blew up in the 20th century because people said, well, we don't want to have kings and priests telling us what to do. We want a little freedom. We found enough people developed consciousness. We had the capacity to develop consciousness. Now, this is part of my argument that consciousness is an evolutionary adaptation, because babies aren't conscious, in my opinion. Babies are alive. They have the potential for consciousness. But this is where some of us don't make it. Some people don't develop enough consciousness, enough self-awareness to actually be independent thinking adults. If you examine people and talk about having that internal monologue, most of us, and my few listeners out there who do this, I'm sure, you have that little voice in your head that you can be thinking about something that's different than how you're behaving. And if you survey people and you ask them about that and you run them through different tests, a small percentage, 5 to 10%, depending on the experimental parameters, will say, there's nothing going on up there. I'm just reacting to things. Those people, I would argue, have a diminished consciousness. So consciousness, like most biological adaptations, is a qualitative trait. It's a quantitative trait. There's a threshold event that says, yes, I have it. I have this self-awareness. I know who I am. But can I act on it? Do I have free will? Do I have the ability to make a decision about things? And once I have that, then I can alter the world around me. I can choose A or B. I can make choices about things and choose to act differently. And like I said, we won't go down that philosophical rabbit hole that says either you have it or you don't. But if we have it and we can make choices and we can look around us and examine the world from a scientific perspective, and we can say, how do we make it better? Well, we should start from what works, and what works is biology. So, and what's the core unit in biology is family. It took me a while to get back to that, but that's where I wanted to start building societies. And so what we have to do in order to build a global society is actually form a legal definition for family. And several science fiction authors have bounced this around. I think Robert Heinlein used it. But the idea of family, a guy like Kurt Vonnegut's Grand Falloon as an idea, as sort of a temporary thing. But if we were to say, as a legal entity within our civilization, the family is a unit that takes care of its own organisms, then we could have the start of perhaps a little better civilization. Because everybody appreciates, I think, how much baggage we all pick up with family. Good stuff, bad stuff. We all develop. It all takes years to develop a human. It takes us a couple of years to become conscious. Most neuroscientists would agree that consciousness, self-awareness really doesn't develop until we're at least 1 or 2 years old. And then once we're in that 1 or 2 years, we start realizing we're self and there's others. And we start working out things. And we react a lot of the time to biological impulses. We still fuss when we're hungry. And we do what's fun, and we learn about the rules. And then we start thinking of ways around the rules. And we think which rules are good and which rules are stupid. And we get punished and we get rewarded. And we have a variety of psychological mechanisms that explain a lot of that. But once again, I'm going to the philosophical end that says at some point, we become self-aware enough and have an internal dialogue enough that says, I can make choices. And some people choose to leave their family. I personally have an estranged daughter who did a whole bunch of events in there. We won't get into that for right now. But I also have other family members who I spend lots of time with. And I would argue, at this point in my life, my core unit is my family. And what would it be legally? There's limited legal obligations. I mean, obviously there's parent-child legalities that come into play. In the American court system, lots of court decisions boil down to what the parents want. And I think building off of that, like once again, building off of what works, would be a really great system to say, let's build up a legal entity that's responsible for everybody. Because that's one of the real challenges in life, is who's responsible and who's not. That's one of the challenges of humans. I personally am dealing with both ends of the spectrum right now. I've got a mother-in-law who's suffering from mental deterioration. She's not demented yet, but she's definitely slipping, and we've had to move her into an assisted living situation. There's the grandchildren are around. They're still minors, and they're still developing. They're not legally responsible, but there's a bunch of other people in the family who are adults. And the adults make decisions for the elderly who need care and the youngsters who haven't fully developed yet. And that's the core of any family unit. We have people who are adults and others who are dependents. And what if we legally embrace that? And we said socially, let's build these family units, but we should make them bigger. Everybody needs family. That's the thing. We should define, and for this discussion, I'm going to use the term granfalloon, borrowing it from Kurt Vonnegut, the author, for those temporary social situations, because this is what would get filed. You would declare a family relationship. And society would say, as a family, you get to make the really important decisions. Because that's one of the things we argue about. What do we make decisions about? Well, ultimately, from a biological perspective, this thing we call artificial selection is about making rules to run the civilization. And we don't seem to be able to agree on how we should do that. We have lots of arguments about who's in charge of what, who can do what behaviors, what should you believe in. Well, if you believe in science, if you accept science as our belief system here in the Church of Science, we say, well, no matter what, you got to stay alive. And so biology and our civilization that's built on this scientific principles should take the basic principle from biology and say, well, the family is the core unit. And the main reason they're the core unit, logically, is because they're the caretakers of a certain set of information. And what information is that? It's their genetic information. Their genetic information is the set of alleles that make white people, brown people, black people, yellow people, whatever weird, non-politically correct term you want to use for the races and the diversity of human life, is the fact that we've got allelic variation. There's a fun word. The alleles are the forms of the genes. We're all human because we share a genome. And the genome is the set of genes, the set of instructions. Now, this is one that sometimes confuses folks, but appreciate the difference between genes and alleles. And it's mainly a historical vocabulary issue, because genes were defined as the units of inheritance. People knew that something was going on, that kids looked like their parents, that pea plants that gave pink flowers more often than not produced pink flowers in their offspring, in the next generation. And we knew that we figured out, and that's to go back to Mendel and Darwin, and they said, yeah, there's some unit of inheritance. But we didn't know about DNA for another century. We didn't figure out the molecular mechanisms of chemical information storage that is DNA and all of the associated biochemistry for over a century later. And so subsequently we developed a vocabulary to try to describe it. And so the genetic package that we call a gene is linked to a certain trait, making hair, or having a liver. There's a whole bunch of genes that make us all human, that make us all the same. And obviously some stuff we can do with that. Some people's genes for hair are defective and they're totally bald. Other people are way hairier and everywhere in between. There's a separate genetic package to make hair color and hair shape, along with liver shape and function. And most of those are pretty constant. And obviously some have variability. And as far as we can tell, about half the stuff is pretty constant in genetics. The alleles would be fixed, is one way we would describe it in evolution, as we would say, well, everybody has to have a liver. If you don't develop a liver, you're not going to survive. So having the genes that help you make a liver and a heart at some level, if you don't do that, you're dead. But what hair color do you have? What skin color do you have? Those are variables that are arguably natural experimentation that's going on. They're the variety that arises through evolutionary change, and it's been adapted for different environments and different situations. And humans have filled up the planet with over 8 billion of us. We've got a lot of variation. And here's then the legal basis for the civilization based on family. Families should declare their genetic lineages and organize around their branches of the family tree. Now, we're already doing that. We do that. You could call it racial identity, whatever you want. Now, here's the real fun part, though. Once you've done that, You then become legally responsible only for your branch of the family tree. And what that basically boils down to, here's how it would work. In our new global civilization is we would have our legal entity, a granfalloon, for the sake of this conversation, for the sake of this talk. A granfalloon would be a bunch of adults who say, we are a granfalloon, we are a legal family. And within that family, we are responsible for the life and death decisions of all of our dependents and all of our adults. Somebody commits a crime within the group, that the family gets to decide. They could put somebody to death if they wanted to. Somebody gets pregnant, they can decide to keep the baby or abort the baby. It's totally up to them. It's totally up because those life and death decisions primarily impact natural selection, which is related to genetic information. That becomes the core unit of our civilization. We have multiple genetic lineages. Each one becomes legally responsible for their own propagation, and they earn that right to control the lives of those individuals if and only if they assume the responsibility for all of their dependents, both elderly and young, and the responsible behaviors of their adults, and they state their rules. They make up their own rules about life and death. And then we could stop arguing about abortion and the death penalty and whatever it is, because we could say, you're a member of this unit. But you'd have to make that very publicly known, that you support abortion or you don't support abortion. You support euthanasia or you don't support euthanasia. Because then, when you go out into the world and interact with other groups, other granfalloons, and things happen and you're subject to their jurisdiction, you have to know. The only way we could ethically hold anyone responsible is if they have the information available to make decisions. And so you have a relationship with somebody else and you decide to have an abortion, and you're from a granfalloon that says, we allow abortion, but the other person is from a granfalloon that doesn't. Who gets to make that decision? Well, arguably it would be the female's family, because the female's granfalloon, because she's bearing the responsibility right now. Until we develop artificial uteri and can grow babies in the lab, which is a separate issue entirely. We'll have to deal with that when we figure out that technology. Until then, the granfalloon should make up that case. And that would be the start of the core of our civilization, of our new civilization. We should legally acknowledge families as the essential political unit. And if you have an elder at some point who's slipped over the edge of lack of responsibility, and you decide with it, or they haven't decided, but it's time for euthanasia, you get to go ahead and carry that out. And there's no legal repercussions because it's your genetic lineage that you're responsible for. That's the core of that family unit. Once we branch beyond that, how do we build that up? Now, how big should that be? Well, some social science research says most of us can only handle a few hundred people, a few hundred relationships. And for mathematical reasons, which I'll talk about in a minute, that, like I said, well, it's just that. The social science has said we can only, on average, people have about 150 people that they have significant relationships with, that they know enough about them, and they have a reciprocal relationship that they can share information. Those individuals would be part of your granfalloon. And that's where it gets a little tricky, because we're going to have these interlocking networks. And you would have to declare your affiliation with a given granfalloon, though, purely for legal purposes, because that's how you're going to vote. You're going to vote on euthanasia and abortion and these ideas of how we're going to distribute our resources to stay alive within that group, because the family has to take care of each other. Or they don't. The rest of us don't care, because we're in our own granfalloons. We're going to be in our own granfalloons, taking care of our own business, and everybody else is going to be responsible for their business. And the business of life and death should be handled in the family. Now, other rules, bigger rules, civilization rules, about how to set up the streets and how to deliver the mail and how to distribute the food and how to pollute the environment, all those things. That's the next level up. We're going to have to take that up into affiliations of Granfalloons into towns or villages, whatever we want to call them. But that would be the next level of organization. We'll talk about that next time. But just at the core of our civilization, we should have responsible families that take care of their own people. Because think about a lot of the problems. What are some of the problems? We talk about drug addiction. We talk about homelessness. Because people have drifted away from their social networks. And we encourage that in America because we don't have a common belief system. What we have is a common economy. We've shifted America ever since the 80s. Talked about this before. It's been a long time coming, but what's the dominant social adaptation that we use to organize our system nowadays is capitalism, is the economy. Who's going to pay for it? And maybe we're swinging back to democracy a little bit. We'll see what happens with this next election. Because as I've said before, I think the biggest choice we have right now is between democracy and capitalism. If democracy is our key social adaptation, then it should boil down to what individuals want. Well, but not everybody gets to decide. The adults get to decide. And the adults should initially make decisions about the most fundamental things, life and death. So that leaves all the matters of family relations up to the members of a given Granfalloon. And that's how we're going to build a better civilization. Next time, we'll start combining some Granfalloons into larger villages. And we'll see who the village idiots are as we start comparing our different Granfalloons and say, oh, that family does this, that Granfalloon does that. And we'll see which ones we like, and we'll conduct this amazing evolutionary experiment, because that's how the Church of Science says we should run our civilization. It should be run on an experimental basis. We don't have all the answers. We acknowledge our ignorance. We accept the fact that we have doubt, and nobody has all the answers. And how can we move forward? We can embrace each other and say, let's take care of each other as best we can. And who is that going to be? Well, at the minimal, it's going to be your community, your Granfalloon. Your core people should be taking care of each other. And if people want to transfer out, then they're on their own. But those of us who are going to take responsibility are the ones who are going to make the rules and run our civilization. Let's see how that works. I will talk to you guys again.